Hello and welcome back to Florida Foodie. I'm Candace Campos.
And I'm Lisa Bell. When the pandemic shut down Florida for months, many growers in the state lost all of their business overnight. Many farmers in Florida sell their crops to resorts, theme parks, the cruise industry, and restaurants. But with all of those industries shuttered, they were forced to let their crops go unpicked and in many cases wasted. Those losses were devastating for so many people. Now, 2 years removed from the start of the pandemic, we are looking to see the full impact of those losses and how Florida's agriculture industry is recovering.
And we are so happy to be joined by Dr. Christa Court from the University of Florida. Welcome, Christa.
Thank you. Thank you guys for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Okay, so we say doctor, so you were a doctor of economics.
Yes, that's correct.
You know, we were joking before we started taping this. I said the one thing I really took out of economics was supply and demand, and that seems to be kind of the main issue when it comes to a lot of this stuff that we're going to be talking about today. So if you can just start off by walking us through, your credentials and what you're working on at the University of Florida.
Sure. So made PhDs in economics, but I'm actually in the Food and Resource Economics department at the University of Florida. So it's more of an agricultural and applied economics department. My expertise is in regional economic modeling. So we do a lot of work in the area of economic impact assessments, also economic contributions to study how important a particular sector or industry is to the state or to a region of the state. And we generally release an annual report on the economic contributions of agriculture, natural resources, and food industries in the state of Florida. About 5 years ago, we started down the road of disaster impact analysis. So we look at the direct economic losses associated with things like hurricane events for agricultural producers, also things like freezes, floods, any of those things. So when the COVID-19 pandemic struck, we were known as the disaster people and were called up to analyze what happened in that particular scenario as well.
And I imagine you will be analyzing the pandemic and its long-term effects for many, many years to come. We are, as we mentioned, 2 years into this now and counting. What are the impacts that you have seen from the shutdowns?
Yeah, so I often tell people we are now going to have a career's worth of data and things to analyze now, right? So one of the things that we did early on, we have sort of a rapid assessment process that we go through for hurricanes. And we retooled that, the survey that we used to be specific to the pandemic early on in the shutdown stages. So we released that in March to mid-May of 2020. It happened to be peak harvest season for a lot of producers, especially in that Southwest Florida area that were producing fruits and vegetables. And we estimated at the time, again, just in that one period of March to mid-May of 2020, $895 million of losses for producers. A lot of that was in fruits and nuts, so about $200 million. But also things like vegetable, melons, potatoes, any kind of animal products. We saw in the news things like milk being dumped because it didn't have that institutional market to go into. And we really had a lot of other things happening in order to translate those estimates to what happened over the entire 2 years. So we don't have a specific value beyond doing that first estimate. We have several other projects underway, though, that looked at what happened throughout 2021. We had USDA funding to do that and are starting to get some results from that analysis and seeing the changes that did take place once things started to open back up and how those were different in Florida from other places because the shutdowns happened at different times. They had different rules to them, and we produced different things than other places. Also, just in looking at how do consumers react, right? So we're talking about supply here so far and what happened to producers, but now, all of us know we consumed food differently during the shutdown, and that might have affected what we go back to permanently. Do we go back to behaving exactly like we did before the pandemic, or are we still eating at home more often than we did before? And that's going to affect how the overall impact of the pandemic.
And I mean, did you see a certain fruit, a certain farmer that kind of was was kind of spared from the pandemic? Was there a niche that was okay?
I think so it did vary by crop, right? And a lot of that was timing, right? If you had something that you were ready to sell to market and that market shut down, as you said at the beginning, almost overnight, it wasn't really an alternative to go to. We like to think that, you could switch and sell it to a different style of consumer, or you could donate it. But the sheer volume of product that comes out of Florida, it didn't allow us to do that for all of it, right? Some of the producers that maybe in the northern Florida area where they had products that were 2-3 months away from being peak harvest season when the shutdowns began, they could kind of prep for that and try to think of alternative ways of selling the products, alternative markets to go through to sell the products. And they were able to, I don't want to say be fully spared, but they were able to prep for it a little bit. And we saw that too when we studied some other states, states that are further north and their products come online later in the year. They had that time to prepare, and they might have even been in the stage where some things were opening back up.
It was such an odd time for everyone when you go back to 2 years ago and so many people were laid off, and we would see the lines miles long of people in food drives trying to get fresh produce, fresh food, anything to feed their family. And then put that up next to, pictures of produce rotting in the field. And you talked about, you examine all sorts of disasters, hurricanes, the pandemic, COVID-19, God forbid, we have something down the road. Do you think that we will be better prepared to try and reduce some of that food waste and try and get it into those areas where there is a need, and so it's not just kind of ended up rotting in the field?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit about infrastructure, right? So when you are talking about Florida product that was rotting in the field, a lot of what we produce goes into the fresh market. And it goes into the fresh market all the way up and down the East Coast, as well as being exported out of the US. So even if we tried to switch to, supplying a little bit of something to everybody in the state, we can't consume everything that we grow in the state of Florida. It's just that much product. And the other thing to consider is the longevity of that product, right? If I'm selling into the fresh market and it doesn't stay fresh for very long, it can only stay on the shelf for so long, especially if it's not refrigerated. Things like food banks just didn't have enough space in order to keep a product refrigerated, even though they were working with their community and taking advantage of refrigerated space outside of their normal space. Again, it just wasn't enough in order to take the volume of fruit that we had. So I think thinking through, food security is not quite the right term, but maybe the ability for us to react to a disaster and switch very quickly. We're going to need additional infrastructure in order to do that. How much that costs in order to make that switch, and how much risk we are at for one of these disasters that requires it again. We'll have to walk through all of those numbers to decide what we can do, right?
I mean, I feel like it's a completely different type of disaster. I mean, it was a different type of disaster for you to research, let alone
with a
farmers.
hurricane, typically, obviously there's crop damage, but usually the power is back on within a few days.
Correct.
For the most part, most of the roads are open and people aren't afraid to come into contact with another person.
Right. It was just, like everything that when it came to the pandemic, it was just unprecedented. The pause. And talking about the infrastructure too,
and all the restaurants
right
shut down. You mentioned briefly the shift in behavior and people obviously eating at home, and will they go back to their old habits? Do you feel like people are still eating at home more than dining out at restaurants? Because when I go out to a restaurant, they're all packed. And what I see is the restaurant owners can't even keep up because they don't even have the staff to deal with the demand for restaurants. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so you are correct that this was very much almost a demand side disaster than a supply side disaster. And that's a very different thing for a producer to consider and determine how they react to. Our group doesn't look so much at the consumption side of things, but we do have others within the department that are looking at this, that are seeing so far still increased sales in some of these fruits and vegetable markets. Some of that is probably due to, an increased demand for eating them at home, as well as going out to restaurants, and also just, I think you have to consider again some of the infrastructure changes that took place. When we have the same experience, we go to a restaurant and it seems like it's packed, but maybe they're not seating all of the tables that they would have sat before, right? They're spacing things out a little bit more, or they're making adjustments for having fewer servers on staff, or to try to accommodate a carry-out order line. Then I think it's a lot more detailed to look into how much food they're putting out the window, how much food the kitchen is putting out the window versus what we're seeing being served at the tables there. But there is, it does seem to be I'm not going to say a permanent shift, but we haven't seen it go all the way back to eating as much away from home as we were pre-pandemic.
So what is the biggest challenge from the pandemic facing Florida farmers and growers right now?
I think it's just still working through a lot of these supply chain disruptions, right? So it's something as big as a pandemic happening and actually shutting down a portion of the economy for a period. We're not going to move away from that in 2 years, right? And the growers are responding in terms of getting ready for the next season. They don't always know exactly what that market is going to look like when the product is ready anyway. So they're used to taking some risk in terms of getting things in the ground and not knowing what will happen to them before they're ready, or what market they will sell into at the end. They're still working through things like trying to get their hands on cardboard boxes that they might put watermelons into, or you might have heard about the issues finding pallets early in the pandemic. So a lot of that is still working its way through supply chains. And now I think we're seeing, compounding effects of other things going on in the world, as well as our adjustment back to this new labor market that we're in now. That's just going to continue to be, each of them a disruption and in a different direction for the farmers that they've got to cope with.
Is there something within your research that all of a sudden you just said, wow, I didn't even think about that, because I didn't even think about the pallets or the cardboard boxes.
Right.
Is there something that really just made you stop for a second and go, okay, that I was not expecting
and
that.
So many things as consumers that we just take for granted.
Right.
Well, they just arrive on a pallet and then they appear because there
Magic.
are employees to put them on a store shelf.
That's right. We've been doing, I would say, something surprising. Specific examples like that surprised me, or the fact that, one of the things we heard initially was the difference in packaging for something that's going to an institutional market versus something you would find on the grocery store shelf. So if I was selling, flour, then I might sell it in this gigantic bag wholesale to a restaurant, but I need these little 1 pound bags that we might see on the grocery store shelves. And the groups that package those products can't switch overnight either. We're used to looking at that. So, I mentioned I do regional economic modeling. So we look at these multiplier effects, or these different rounds of spending that happen due to final demand for one specific product. So we're used to seeing, the lawyers are important, the finance people are important.
Right.
And I think a lot of people forget that when they're just trying to think about the food system, right? So they think it's the farmer, and then maybe it goes to, a packager or a processor, and then it shows up on the shelf, or it shows up at the restaurant, and those largely look the same in their mind. But they're actually very, very different. The logistics involved, and the packaging that's involved, the time that it takes to do one versus the other, and just all of the middle of that supply chain looks very different. Whether or not a farmer needs financial assistance, whether they need legal help in order to sell into one market versus another. Do they need to be able to be an expert at online sales? Maybe not before the pandemic, and a lot of them have moved in that direction now. And so there's a lot of service sectors that are important there as well. So we've probably seen a boom in several of those.
How much is the labor market affecting Florida farmers?
I think that's another one that, initially early in the pandemic, the effects were different than they might be right now. So we use a lot of guest workers that come in from Latin America on H-2A certifications. There was some initial, during the shutdown, questions as to whether or not that program was going to go on. And it ultimately did. And we did a lot of education with both the workers and the managers of those work crews that were coming in the pandemic. When I say we, I'm talking about the University of Florida's IFAS extension faculty throughout the state. Now, I think it's the same labor issues that are affecting many other industries. A lot of people shifted the positions during the pandemic. Some were able to stay on. Some things shut down. They lost employees, and now they're trying to get employees back. The other thing, when we see these peaks in surges for COVID cases, you have a lot of employees that are out sick or potentially exposed through a child that was in school or any other situation that's going on at home that causes a pause on the farm or a pause in these processing plants as well.
I mean, I feel like we're riding this wave because, the pandemic happened, everything shut down. So then it was a issue of just getting stuff out. Then, months later, it became the truckers were becoming, there was an issue there. And then it goes to the restaurants and then the packaging and now it's the labor and the Delta variant. And now it's now the labor shortage. I just feel like, is this wave going to finally just kind of
when do you think
down?
We will be as close to normal as we possibly can be?
Now, I can't answer that question.
Forecast it for us, please.
So I think it comes back to this idea, we call it rounds of spending in the area of economics that I do, but it's really about, I think you're seeing these play out over time, and we never really know how long it will fully take place to get all the way through. So think of something like a citrus grower. There's a certain number of things that they have to purchase in order to produce citrus for whatever market that they're selling it into, right? That might include fertilizer, it might include plant trees from the nursery, the labor to pick the fruit. Then if you take one step back, in order to get the trees from the nursery grower had to purchase a whole bunch of input goods and services in order to produce that tree for the citrus grower. Right. And you can keep taking a step back and say, all right, the nursery grower had to have fertilizer, maybe was one of the things they needed. Well, a fertilizer producer had to at some point purchase input goods and services to produce that fertilizer. So I think if you really thought through the complexity of all of those purchases and all of those different rounds, that's what we're still seeing play out here. And it's playing out with all of these compounding events. Like what's going on between Russia and Ukraine right now, those are going to be on top of what we're still seeing play out from the pandemic.
How is that affecting Florida farmers, that conflict?
I don't, it's not one that we have analyzed specifically in our group. One of the things that I hear most about from growers is the rise in fertilizer prices that is related to that conflict. So that's increasing prices of inputs and may or may not see an increase in the price that they're getting at the end of harvest season. So the profits will go down if their expenditures are going way up, but the revenues are not.
What do you see as the biggest threat facing Florida farmers? Is it the pandemic? Is it citrus greening? Is it climate change?
Hurricanes, war?
Yeah.
So I think it's all of these things, right? So in Florida, we are used to having things like hurricanes. Sometimes we get more than one hurricane in one particular hurricane season, right? And we still have farming in the state, right? The farmers in Florida are resilient, they're hardworking, and they're going to keep facing these compounding effects of disasters over time. Takes a toll, right? So I think we should also consider things like, mental health. We heard a lot about mental health just in the general population as we went through the pandemic. But if you have to keep facing a lot of these different types of hazard events over time, that can take a toll as well. So I think, just we have a large cooperative extension faculty in the state of Florida, both from the University of Florida, Florida A&M University. We're always there to try to combat any disaster that comes, right? So I think we've learned a lot from the past. We're ready to face those types of disasters again, but then we're also ready to realize that the compound effects of these over time is taking a toll, and we need to find solutions for that as well.
I mean, we were also just, we were just talking about, like, we have COVID, we have hurricanes, we have, the changing climate, all this stuff. Have you seen some farmers just close up shop and just say, I'm done with it? Take me out of the research. We're done?
Some did. Yeah, some did. When we initially asked that survey, we had to ask, are you closed? Did you shut down, or are you still open? If you are shut down, do you plan to reopen? And there were some that answered that survey as, no, we've given up. In some cases, that was solely because of the pandemic. In other cases, it might have been some other things that were compounding over time, and the pandemic was the straw that broke the camel's back. But there have been some that have gone completely out. On the other hand, the pandemic has given everybody a chance to adapt, and there's some people that are coming into farming in the state of Florida at the same period. So.
And we often hear, in the news that Florida is the number one destination for people across the country to move to. How is development affecting Florida farmers? Because we hear that a lot too, that, they're kind of they have no choice but to sell because the prices are just so good for their land, and that's putting added pressure on the Florida farming industry.
Yeah, that's an additional thing that they have to consider, is just development. And the unique shape of the state, the direction that we can develop is inland, right? And that's where a lot of this agricultural production takes place. So the land values are going up for that reason. It's still, I don't know that I would say they have to sell when that happens, but the price is such that they're willing to do that.
Yeah. Well,
is there anything positive that we end with a positive note?
No, I think we have had a positive note, right? Like, they're adapting, and a majority of them are still sticking it out, staying through the pandemic. I think that everyone has had to adapt. Farmers are not unique in that perspective, but they have diversified the market channels that they're selling through. I myself have found that there's a lot more, if I would like it, local product available to me. And I know about it now because there are more people advertising through social media, or there are more people that have a U-Pick operation or an agritourism operation, or just a place that I can order online and pick up on the farm or pick up somewhere here in town that wasn't there pre-pandemic. Or if it was there, I didn't hear about it as often as I hear about it now. So I think there are a lot of ways that farmers have been able to adapt. They've been able to connect with the local community even more than they were able to do so in the past. And that's a bright note. And I also think that all of us know a little bit more about where our food comes from, having lived through this and having seen everything on the news. So I hope that we can take that into consideration and be thankful for it.
And I feel like oftentimes when we think about farmers, we think, oh, well, in order to be a farmer, you have to have thousands upon thousands of acres and be producing all sorts of stuff. But many of the people you were just kind of talking about, have kind of smaller areas.
Yeah, it's a passion.
It is a passion, and they are making a livelihood out of it and serving their community.
Yeah, so there are a lot of small farms in the state of Florida also. So we actually have 47,000 farms in the state of Florida that operate on about 9.7 million acres. And they produce $10 billion worth of crops, livestock, and forest products. So it's not, we're not talking about solely thousands of acres out there. We have some larger producers, we have some middle-sized producers, and then there's a lot of small producers that, we talked about the geographic difference at the beginning. There was a difference in how those size sections were impacted by the pandemic as well. So I think we forget that there's a lot of small producers.
And where can we find information? I know you guys continue to do research throughout the year. I mean, what's the next, release of information, new numbers, how things are starting to shift?
Yeah, so we're always working on trying to get things up on our website. So I direct the UFIFIS Economic Impact Analysis Program. We have a website, and we also have a website specific to our disaster impact analysis. So you can find those there. Google should take you straight to those without me having to go through the complete URL.
We'll most likely link it as well on clickorlando.com/foodie.
Yep.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much for joining us. It is fascinating, and it's, a part of our state that affects each and every one of us every single day, whether it's the food that we put in our mouth or our pocketbook. We're all touched by this in some way or another, and it's interesting to see, what's affecting our farmers in our state and what we can do to continue to support them. Right. Thank you so much.
Yep, you're welcome.
Thank you for listening to Florida Foodie. We'd also like to thank our guest, Dr. Christa Court with the University of Florida. Please take the time to follow our hosts online. Search Lisa Bell News on Facebook and Instagram, or Lisa Bell News 6 on Twitter. And for Candace Campos, you can find her on Twitter. Just search @Candace News 6, and on Facebook, search Candace Campos News 6. Also, a big thank you to our technical producers, Derek Mosier and Ryan Haley, and our director, Rich Burns. I'm the show's producer, Thomas Mates. Please take the time to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or you can tell a friend about us. It really helps us out. And you can find videos of all of our podcasts on clickorlando.com/Florida Foodie, and be sure to sign up for the Florida Foodie newsletter while you're there.